Nancy Muller tasted blood before the first bell for dinner finished ringing. Lady Bexley's ring had a square emerald in a claw setting and edges sharp enough to cut. It struck Nancy's mouth when she answered, "Yes, my lady," one beat too slowly in the withdrawing room, and the stone split her lower lip as neatly as a paper knife. "Must one drag obedience from you by force every evening?" Lady Bexley asked, as if discussing weather. "You are 22, not 12. Nancy kept her eyes lowered. "I beg pardon, ma'am." "Do not beg. Perform." Lady Bexley adjusted one pearl drop at her ear and turned back to the mirror. The Henderson account books are in disorder. The invitations to Lady Carr's musicale remain unanswered, and Sir Piers arrives at 8. "I will not have him finding you ink-stained and sullen." "Yes, my lady." "Wipe your face. You look melodramatic." Nancy pressed her tongue to the cut and tasted iron. She curtsied, moved backward 3 steps, and left before the woman could invent a second fault. In the passage, where nobody stood close enough to inspect her, she touched her lip with the corner of her cuff and saw a thin, bright line. Her father had built this house room by room, ledger by ledger, from wool contracts and mill rents and careful credit. It had been a laughing house then, loud with carts in the yard and arguments over tea, with maps spread over tables, and Nancy, at 11, at 12, allowed to listen while men discussed tariffs and shipping and crop failure, as if her mind were not ornamental but useful. After his death, Lady Bexley had married into the widowhood like a claimant into disputed land, legal, efficient, and relentless. In 4 years, Nancy's place had shrunk from daughter to convenience. She copied correspondence in a hand admired by solicitors who addressed every note to Madam Bexley. She mended household accounts no steward could untangle. She sat at the edge of tables where plans were made for her future, as if she were a parcel whose carriage had already been paid. Guests called her plain in front of her, gently, of course, as if kindness softened cruelty. "Such a useful girl," one viscountess had said that very week, dipping sugar with 2 fingers. "Not pretty enough to be foolish. Not pretty, because she did not powder herself into chalk, because her hair was dark where current fashion preferred fair, because her eyes were too large and direct for coquetry, because hunger and discipline had carved her face into fine lines no one knew how to flatter. Plain was a convenient word. It meant ignorable. It meant available. Nancy kept one private rebellion. In her father's old office, behind the false back of a drawer everyone assumed held obsolete receipts, she had hidden his ledgers, not copies, originals. Every transfer, every trust, every signed witness line in his narrow, upright script. At night, when the house slept, she read by a hooded candle and followed columns of figures like tracks through snow. Men assumed women did not understand numbers unless they came stitched into dowries. Her father had taught her otherwise, tapping ink-stained fingers against pages while she recited compound interest before she knew French verbs. By the time the second bell rang, Nancy had rinsed her mouth, pinned up her hair and tied it with the black ribbons she wore when mourning had become habit rather than ceremony. She stepped into the small breakfast room, now set for dinner. Lady Bexley preferred cramped control to gracious display, and took her place halfway down the table, near the sideboard, where she could be summoned without being seen. Sir Piers Allerton arrived at 8 precisely, broad and perfumed and rosy with wine before he had touched a glass in their house. He was a widowed baronet with heavy lids, pale lashes, and a habit of looking at women as if estimating horseflesh. He had money enough to lend, rank enough to matter, and age enough to remember campaigns that lived in Nancy's books as dates. He bowed to Lady Bexley with calculated warmth, kissed the air near her hand, and sat opposite Nancy. "My dear Miss Merla," he said before soup was served. "You grow quieter each week. Marriage will cure that." Lady Bexley laughed, quick and bright. "You hear, child? Sir Piers means to save you from your own reserve." Nancy folded her napkin once more than necessary. "I had not known I required saving, sir." Sir Piers's smile deepened, pleased at what he took for spirit. "All women do from time to time." No one asked if she wished to be rescued into him. Courses arrived and vanished. Talk rose around her. Hunting schedules, London rooms, appointments in town before the season properly opened. Lady Bexley steered every current expertly, letting names and debts and invitations drift together until by the time roast pheasant had cooled on plates, she set down her fork and said with theatrical lightness, "Since all our friends are so dear and so discreet, we may as well share family joy. Nancy has accepted Sir Piers's generous offer. Contracts are being reviewed." The room hummed. A lady gasped in delight. Someone congratulated Sir Piers. He raised his glass to Nancy, who stared at the candle flame wavering in the bowl as if movement in light might alter fact. "I have accepted nothing," she said. Lady Bexley did not look at her. "Do not be childish. We discussed this." "You inform me!" Now Lady Bexley turned, smile fixed, eyes hard. "And you understood. You are provided for beyond your expectation. I suggest gratitude." Sir Piers chuckled, oily and patient. "Let the girl have a blush. She will thank us both in 6 months." Nancy pushed her chair back. Then from the gravel drive below the windows came the sharp skitter of hooves, a shout cut short, and the heavy, unmistakable crack of a body striking stone. For one suspended second, every face at table lifted and waited for a servant to deal with it. Nancy was already moving. She reached the front steps before the first footman found courage to run. Rain had begun, thin and cold, turning the drive to silver streaks under lantern light. A horse danced sideways, reins dragging, eyes rolling white. Near the curb lay a man in dark coat and mud, one hand braced against the stones, blood bright between his fingers. "Hold the mare," Nancy called, and 2 grooms lunged belatedly. She dropped to her knees in her good hem and caught the injured hand. Deep cut along the palm, not arterial, bleeding freely. The man's jaw was set in a way that suggested anger rather than fear. He tried to pull away. "Be still," she said. "You can scold me after." He stared at her as if no one had spoken to him that way in years. Rain darkened his hair at the temples. His face was lean, severe, patrician enough to belong on coinage. She had seen that face in engraved portraits and newspapers left open on tables where legislation mattered. Lord Alistair Vale, Duke of Norcroft. The footman behind her made a strangled sound and dropped into a bow no one noticed. Nancy stripped off her glove with her teeth, then tugged the black ribbon from her hair. Dark strands spilled down her back. She wrapped the ribbon around his palm, crossed once, tightened and tied the knot her father had taught her, for ropes and crates and stubborn barrels, fast to secure, faster to release. Sailor's hitch, practical, inelegant, sure. "There," she said, "pressure. Keep your hand elevated if you value it." His gaze had fixed first on the knot, then on her face, with an intensity so abrupt it felt like being gripped. "Who are you?" he asked. "Oh, Nancy Muller." Something changed in his expression. No softening exactly, but a fracture in composure, as if a memory had struck from inside. Rain ran down the ridge of his cheekbone. He repeated, almost to himself, "Muller." Lady Bexley swept onto the steps in a rustle of silk and outrage. "Your Grace! What catastrophe!" Her eyes dropped to Nancy kneeling in mud with her hair unbound and her hand on a duke's wrist. For one instant, calculation flashed nakedly across her face before concern covered it. "Nancy, stand up at once. You forget yourself." "I remember first aid," Nancy said, rising because there was no point in gifting spectacle. Servants swarmed now that rank had been identified. The Duke allowed them to assist him to his feet, but did not release Nancy's ribbon. "Send for my surgeon," he told his groom, voice cool again. To Lady Bexley he inclined his head. "Forgive the intrusion. My horse disliked your lower gait." "We are honoured by any intrusion, Your Grace," Lady Bexley said smoothly. "Please come in from this weather. We insist." He looked once more at Nancy, who stood dripping and breathing hard, hair loose, lip cut open anew where she had bitten it. Whatever he saw seemed to settle into decision. "Thank you, Miss Muller," he said, with formal precision that made the words public. "You were prompt." By breakfast the story had outpaced fact. In the market square, a butcher's wife told it as a deliberate tumble staged at Lady Bexley's drive to force introduction. By noon, 2 separate callers inquired delicately after Nancy's health, with the bright eyes of women who carried gossip as civic duty. By 1 o'clock, Lady Bexley had chosen her version and repeated it to everyone who would matter in London by post. "I am mortified," she declared in the morning room to Mrs. Dent and Lady Harrow, loud enough for Nancy to hear from the writing desk. "One does one's best with girls who have no proper maternal guidance. A dramatic rescue in wet muslin before half the county. I could sink through the floor." Mrs. Dent tittered. "Surely not intentional." "My dear, she rushed out before footman. No chaperone, hair down, grasping his person." Lady Bexley pressed fingers to her temple. "I blame German impulsiveness. Her poor father never corrected it." Nancy's pen point snapped cleanly through the tail of a G. That afternoon, Sir Piers came early. He shut the library door with proprietary ease and stood too close to Nancy's chair. "You have made yourself talked about," he said, almost genial. "No great harm if we move quickly." "Move what quickly?" "Wedding date. Special licence, perhaps. Best to settle matters before the season spins stories beyond use." "Use?" she repeated. He smiled without humour. "Everything is use, Miss Muller, including reputation. Especially yours." When she did not answer, he bent nearer, wine on his breath. "Do not mistake my patience for fragility. Your stepmother's obligations to me are considerable. I can be generous in collection or otherwise." He left before she could throw the inkstand at his head. At dusk, Lady Bexley summoned Nancy to the blue salon. 2 solicitors sat with papers arrayed like weapons. The Duke was there as well, standing by the mantel, gloved, expression unreadable. Lady Bexley spoke first. "His Grace has made a proposal of service. His young sister requires a suitable companion for part of the season. He has, for reasons of his own, named you." Nancy looked at the Duke. "Named me?" "If you are willing," he said. "Temporarily. My sister requires steadiness, not ornament." Lady Bexley laughed brittly. "How practical we all are tonight." Nancy felt the room tilt toward trap, whichever answer she gave. Leave, and she might escape Sir Piers's immediate hand, but enter a duke's household under clouded rumour. Refuse, and Lady Bexley would marry her within a fortnight and call it mercy. "Why me?" Nancy asked, quieter. His gaze met hers, direct as last night in rain. "Because you are competent, and because my household can protect what yours does not." Lady Bexley's fans stilled. One solicitor cleared his throat. "Certain debt instruments have, changed holders this afternoon. Sir Piers Allerton's notes, secured against Bexley properties, were purchased by His Grace at premium." Silence slammed down. Lady Bexley recovered first. "How magnanimous!" she said, each syllable clipped thin. Then we are all, it seems, indebted." The Duke did not look at her. "Miss Muller is free to accept or refuse. No coercion! No coercion, in a room built of it." Nancy folded her hands to stop their shaking. If she stayed, she would be sold. If she left, she might yet gather breath enough to fight. Her father's ledgers waited in their hidden drawer like witnesses. No one had called. "I will go," she said. Lady Bexley's smile returned in miniature, sharp as pinwire. "Of course you will. You always were useful." Later, packing in her narrow room under the eaves, Nancy moved with method. 3-day dresses, 2 evening gowns altered past elegance, her father's small brass ruler, the ledger key hidden in a thimble case. She paused at the mirror. Without the black ribbon, her hair fell in a dark wave to her waist. The ribbon itself was gone, tied around a duke's hand somewhere across county roads, soaked once in rain and blood. Below, carriage wheels ground over gravel. Lady Bexley called instructions in honeyed tones meant for listening servants. Sir Piers's laughter drifted from the hall, too loud, already offended. Nancy closed her trunk and set her palm flat on the lid. At stake was not romance. She had no leisure for fantasies of men with titles and haunted eyes. At stake was legal existence. Her name, her father's trust, the right to refuse a bargain made over her head. If Lady Bexley succeeded in painting her compromised, illegitimate, indebted, no magistrate would hear her. No contract would require her consent. She would disappear respectably into Sir Piers's house and be congratulated for it. She lifted the trunk handle. For 4 years she had endured blows, cuts, humiliations, and the daily erasure of being spoken about as if absent. Endurance had kept her alive. It had not kept her free. Downstairs, the Duke's groom took her case. In the carriage doorway, Nancy turned once toward the lit windows of her father's house, now Lady Bexley's stage, and tasted iron again where the cut in her lip had reopened. She did not wipe it away this time. The carriage lurched forward, lamps swinging, and the Bexley house slid backward into rain and shadow. Nancy sat opposite the Duke, hands folded too tightly in her lap, while water ticked from the brim of his hat onto the carriage floor. He had removed his glove from the injured hand. Her black ribbon, darkened almost indistinguishably by blood and rain, was still knotted around his palm. He did not touch it. He did not look at it. He looked instead out the window, profile cut hard against the glass. Only when they had cleared the village and the wheels found smoother road did he speak. "Miss Muller," he said, "you are under no obligation to remain if my house proves disagreeable. If you wish, I can have you settled with Mrs. Ashcombe, my aunt in Bath, by week's end." The offer was sensible. It was also, Nancy thought, a way to keep things impersonal. "I am not made of spun sugar, Your Grace." "No," he said, "that is apparent." She almost smiled, then didn't. Then why this caution? His jaw shifted once, as if he had bitten back a more candid answer. "Because the world is eager to injure women who have already been discussed." He said it without ornament, and because of that she believed he meant it. They drove in silence until iron gates emerged from mist and opened onto a long lanterned approach lined with bare limes. Norcroft House rose at the end of it, less a house than a statement in pale stone, all severe symmetry and dark windows lit gold from within. Not warm exactly, guarded. Servants were waiting under the portico in disciplined rows. No scrambling, no whispers. A butler with silver hair and military posture stepped down to open Nancy's door before a groom reached it. "Miss Muller," he said with perfect neutrality, "welcome to Norcroft House. I am Brindle. No curiosity, no pity, merely fact. Inside, heat and beeswax and polished wood enclosed her like another kind of weather. Her wet cloak vanished into competent hands. A maid appeared to conduct her upstairs, but a clear young voice called from the gallery, "Is that she?" A girl of perhaps 17 came forward before anyone could stop her, slim as a reed, dark-eyed like her brother, but with more light in her face. She wore a dressing gown over an evening frock and no slippers. "Eleanor," the Duke said, not sharply, but with weight. I know, propriety." She ignored him and came straight to Nancy. "I am Lady Eleanor Vale. If you are to endure this mausoleum with me, we ought to begin honestly. I detest embroidery, cannot dance a quadrille without counting aloud, and have been promised at least 3 idiotic men this spring. Do you play chess?" Nancy blinked. "Badly." "Excellent, so do I. We shall terrify each other." "Lena," the Duke warned. Lady Eleanor leaned in, lowering her voice as if sharing treason. "He is only severe when frightened." The Duke's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Bed!" "Yes, Alistair." She grinned at Nancy, wholly undimmed, and allowed herself to be herded off by the maid. Nancy watched her go, then turned back to him. "Your sister appears to have no fear of rank." "She has too much sense of it," he said. "She simply refuses to perform awe at home." He inclined his head, formal again. "You will have adjoining rooms to hers in the East Wing. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we can discuss terms, duties, and boundaries." "Boundaries," Nancy repeated. "I prefer clarity to scandal." She met his gaze levelly. "Scandal has already arrived, Your Grace. It left before us and will be waiting in your breakfast room." Something like reluctant approval moved across his face. "Then we shall not keep it hungry." Scandal did indeed take breakfast. By 9:30, 2 cards had arrived, on matters of concern from ladies who had ignored Norcroft invitations all winter and now felt sudden social obligation. By 10, a note from Lady Harrow, one of Lady Bexley's morning-room intimates, regretted she could not possibly receive Lady Eleanor this Thursday, while circumstances remained fluid. Nancy was copying correspondence in the small morning library when Brindle delivered the note on a silver tray. He did not comment. Lady Eleanor, reading over Nancy's shoulder, made an inelegant sound. "Fluid?" she said. "Am I a river?" Nancy folded the paper. "Apparently you are flood risk." Lady Eleanor laughed, then sobered. "I'm sorry they are doing this because of you." "No," Nancy said. "They are doing this because cruelty is fashionable and cheap." At noon, the Duke requested her presence in his study. The room was large without being grand, lined floor to ceiling with books in sober bindings. A fire laid but unlit. 2 dispatch boxes sat open on the desk beside neatly stacked memoranda. Efficiency had a smell here. Paper, ink, leather, restraint. He stood when she entered, waited until the door closed, and motioned her to the chair opposite. "Your role with my sister," he said, "is companion, correspondence aide, and chaperone at smaller calls where my aunt cannot attend. You will be paid quarterly. You may dismiss any servant in Eleanor's suite from your service with cause. If anyone in my household speaks to you without civility, you tell Brindle. If Brindle fails, you tell me. You expect failure? I expect humanity." He slid a document toward her, terms clear and unexpectedly fair. At bottom waited a line for her signature. Nancy read every clause. He watched, not impatient, merely alert. When she finished, she looked up. "There is no duration." "Until the end of the season," he said, "or sooner if you prefer." "And if Lady Bexley demands my return?" "She may demand whether to reverse. Neither command binds me." Her fingers rested on the page. "You bought Sir Piers's notes to free her hand from his throat." I bought them to remove urgency. His voice stayed flat. Not intent. Lady Bexley will seek another method. She already has one, Nancy said quietly. Defamation. He regarded her for a beat. You have seen something? Not yet. I've heard enough of her planning to know she never strikes once. He nodded as if this confirmed a private calculation. Then we proceed as if attack is certain. There it was again. Partnership offered in tactics, not tenderness. For reasons she could not name, it steadied her more than comfort might have. She signed. That evening she attended Lady Eleanor to a small musicale in Mayfair, where 6 women and 2 men managed to perform 37 varieties of disdain without once raising their voices. Nancy stood just behind Eleanor's shoulder while introductions were made and not made. Miss Mellor, one dowager said, peering. Müller, Nancy answered. How continental, the woman murmured and turned away before Nancy could decide whether it was insult or diagnosis. A duchess with diamond stars in her hair smiled thinly. How charitable of Norcroft to cultivate merit. Another added, I hear she is very useful with figures, almost like a clerk. Nancy kept her expression still. Lady Eleanor, to her credit, said brightly, Indeed. And unlike most clerks, she can spot arithmetic dishonesty at 20 paces. We find that invaluable this season. The Duchess blinked, uncertain whether she had been flattered or threatened. Nancy looked straight ahead and memorised every face. When they returned near midnight, the Duke was in the front hall, cloak still on, as if he had only just come in from Parliament papers. His eyes moved once over Eleanor, then to Nancy's mouth, where the old cut had reopened in the cold. You are bleeding, he said. Nancy touched her lip, surprised. Only a little, Lady Eleanor rolled her eyes. If you mean to ask whether anyone was rude, the answer is yes, everyone with craftsmanship. He took this in without visible reaction. Go to bed, Lena. When she had gone, he said to Nancy, You need not accompany my sister tomorrow. Because of my lip. Because you were attacked all evening. So was she. She cannot withdraw from society every time women sharpen their manners. For the first time, something like heat entered his voice. You are not required to prove endurance to me. Nancy felt the words strike old bruises. Good, she said. I am trying to stop proving it to anyone. He went still. A moment passed. One of those precarious moments in which apology, argument, or confession might emerge. He chose none. Very well, he said, and stepped aside so she could pass. Lady Bexley's first forged letter arrived 3 days later. It came folded inside an envelope addressed to Lady Eleanor in an unfamiliar legal hand, marked private and urgent. Brindle brought it to Nancy because Eleanor was still abed, then paused when he saw the seal half broken already from rough transit. Shall I return it unopened? He asked. Nancy turned the paper over. The seal was not a family crest, but a notary's stamp from Southampton, impressed crookedly, wax too soft. Open it, she said. He did, and read silently, his mouth thinning by imperceptible degrees. Then he handed it to her. To the Right Honourable the Duke of Norcroft's household, it began in stiff, formal phrasing. It purported to be from one Mr. Peter Glave, attorney for the late Johann Müller's outstanding creditors, asserting that Nancy was born before lawful marriage, lacked standing to any trust established under Müller name, and remained morally and financially unsuitable for reputable domestic placement. A second sheet listed alleged unpaid debts in her father's hand, signatures copied clumsily enough to fool a stranger, not a daughter. Nancy read to the bottom once, twice, then set it down with care because her fingers had started to tremble. "Burn it!" Brindle asked. "No!" Her voice came out level by force. "File it, then send a rider to Southampton to inquire whether Peter Glaive exists." Brindle's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Yes, Miss Muller." By luncheon, 3 more letters had arrived in similar style to 3 different addresses in the house. Lady Bexley was not merely slandering, she was ceding a record. That afternoon, at a call in Grosvenor Square, a magistrate's wife greeted Lady Eleanor with brittle warmth and took Nancy aside under pretence of admiring hothouse camellias. "My dear," she said, lowering her voice to syrup, "if there is irregularity in your birth, discretion now may preserve future comfort. Many excellent arrangements can be made for girls with uncertain claims." "Thank you," Nancy said, "but I am not uncertain of my own birth." The woman patted her wrist as if soothing hysteria. "Certainty is not evidence." Nancy nearly laughed at the elegance of the cruelty. That night she requested audience with the Duke and found him in his study over a spread of papers, coat discarded, sleeves rolled, lamplight throwing fatigue into the hollows beneath his eyes. A decanter sat untouched. He looked up at once. "You've seen them?" "Yes." He pushed one packet toward her. Inside were copies of the same forged claims, now routed to 2 banking houses and 1 parish office. Efficient poisoning. "I have men tracing the stamp and courier routes," he said, "and I have written to my solicitor for injunction." "Injunction against rumour?" Nancy asked. "You can't restrain drawing-room conversation by writ." "No, but I can challenge document fraud." She stood very straight. "She is trying to erase legal personhood before I can contest anything. If she proves I am illegitimate, any trust from my father dissolves into her management. If she proves debt, I become collateral." "I know." "Then let me at the original estate papers." He stilled. "Which papers?" "Your steward holds copies of property transfers between my father and the Bexley Trust. I need dates, witnesses, registry entries." His expression closed, iron dropping into place. "Those archives are not for general household access." "General," she said softly. "Is that what I am?" "This is not insult. It is protocol." "Protocol is what men call locked doors when women ask for keys." A muscle moved in his cheek, and recklessness is what women call strategy when they are angry. Silence flashed hot between them. At last he said quieter, "I will have extracts prepared. Extracts can be chosen." He met her stare. "So can allies, Miss Muller." She wanted to throw his own composure back at him like glass. Instead, she took one breath, then another. "Very well," she said. "Then I will choose mine." She left before he could answer. By morning, word had spread enough that one hostess sent a polite withdrawal of Nancy's invitation to spare all parties embarrassment, and another invited her pointedly as an instructive social experiment. Lady Eleanor tore that card in half and fed it to the fire. "Experiment," she muttered. "I should like to experiment with her tiara and a carriage wheel." Nancy almost thanked her, but thanks felt too small for this kind of loyalty. Instead, she said, "Will your brother be home before dinner?" Lady Eleanor eyed her. "Yes. Why?" "I should like to apologise," Nancy said, "and then demand his library." She did both. He heard the apology with the same grave attention he brought to parliamentary petitions, then said, "Accepted," as if sealing treaty terms. At her demand he hesitated only a moment before crossing to a cabinet, withdrawing a key ring and selecting one long brass key. "The West Library stays locked because my father collected enemies who preferred fire to argument," he said. "Do not bring candles among the lower shelves. There are storm lamps on the central table. Brindle has instructions." He set the key in her palm. Warm metal, surprising trust. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Muller." He stopped. She waited. "If you find anything that frightens you," he said, at last, voice controlled too tightly, "bring it to me before you confront anyone." She should have asked why that sounded like prior knowledge. Instead, she nodded and went. The West Library was larger than his study, and older, built when books were still chained and politics done by patronage and pistol. Gallery tiers climbed into shadow. Long windows looked over the frozen lawn. Shelves held estate surveys, parliamentary records, private correspondence, maps, naval logs, account books thick as bricks. Dust lay everywhere except on the central table, where someone had recently worked and left the ghost rectangles of removed stacks. Nancy began with registry ledgers from the year before her father's death, and worked forward, tracing land parcels and trust disbursements by witness initials. Hours passed. Lamps hissed softly. Her eyes burned. Near midnight, she knelt by a lower cabinet whose bottom drawer stuck halfway. She tugged. It gave with a jolt, spilling bundled memoranda and one narrow leather case that must have been lodged behind for years. The case hit the floor and cracked open. Inside lay a ribbon. Not black. Blue, once vivid, now faded to weathered sky. It had been folded around a brass military button and tied with an old, careful knot. One edge of the ribbon was stained brown, long dried, unmistakable. Nancy stared. Memory came not as image first, but as sensation. Wet wool under her hands, night wind off the mill race. A boy-man breathing hard through clenched teeth while she whispered, "Quiet, please, they are still outside." 11 years collapsed. She had been 11, barefoot, hair in a blue ribbon because it was Sunday best, and she refused to take it off after church. Smugglers had run crates through the lower copse that night, shouting, then a shot. She had found him behind flour sacks in the mill store, older, bloodied, furious at needing help. She had torn off her ribbon and tied his hand because it was bleeding everywhere, because father was away and no one else was near. Before dawn, he had gone with men who arrived silent and armed. She had never learned his name, only that his coat button came loose as he stood, and she had pressed it at him, and he had looked at her as if memorizing a map. She touched the ribbon now with 2 fingers. The door opened behind her. She turned. The Duke stood on the threshold, no coat, only waistcoat and shirt sleeves, as if he had come the moment he realized where she was. His gaze dropped to her hands and stopped. For a long time neither spoke. When he did, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "I wondered when you would find that." Nancy rose slowly, ribbon in hand. "It is mine." "Yes, you kept it." He gave one sharp exhale, almost a laugh stripped of humour. "Through Eton, through my majority, through every infernal speech in the Lords, where men lied with polished teeth. I kept it in a dispatch case when I travelled, and in that drawer when I pretended I did not believe in sentiment." "Why?" His eyes lifted to hers, and for once there was no armour, only old memory and something like weariness. "Because when I was 17, he said, "I thought myself invulnerable. I went with magistrate men to catch smugglers near your father's mill. We blundered, they scattered, and one of them opened my hand to the bone. I stumbled into your storehouse half fainting and met a child who did not scream, did not flatter, did not ask my rank. She told me to be still, tied a knot better than my valet, and hid me until my people came." Nancy's throat tightened. "I remember your blood on the flour sacks. I remember thinking you were too proud to survive." A flicker at the corner of his mouth. "Accurate." She looked down at the blue ribbon, then back at him. "At the drive, when I tied your hand, you used the same hitch." He swallowed once and gave the same order. "Be still. I knew before you spoke your surname. When you did," he shook his head, controlled himself, went on, I had searched years ago. Muller was a common enough name in trade counties. By the time I had enough authority to ask questions without causing damage, your father was dead and records obscured. By Lady Bexley. Yes. The room seemed suddenly too small for all that had shifted inside it. She had been remembered. Not as gossip, not as utility. Remembered. Sought. Nancy sat back down because her knees had decided, without consulting dignity, that standing was optional. She set the ribbon carefully on the table. "Why not tell me in the carriage?" she asked. "Because I did not know whether you would welcome being found." His mouth hardened. "And because I have seen men use old gratitude to purchase present obedience. I would sooner cut off my hand than ask that of you." For the second time in as many days, he struck straight through habit to truth so cleanly it hurt. She looked at the blue ribbon, faded but intact after 11 years of being carried through his life like a private oath. Then she looked at the stacks of forged lies waiting on desks across London, at her own reflection faint in the dark window glass, no longer a shadow by the sideboard, no longer a parcel to be transferred. "When is Lady Bexley's masquerade?" she asked. He blinked at the turn. "Fortnight." "Why?" "She invited half the county, and if she keeps to pattern at least 3 magistrates, she intends to announce my engagement publicly there, with documents." His expression sharpened, strategic mind catching up. "A crowded room is difficult ground. A crowded room is witness." Nancy rose. "If I accuse her in private, she will call me hysterical and bury it. If I accuse her in public with ledgers, signatures, and her own transfers read aloud, she cannot smother all mouths at once. That is dangerous." "Yes." Her pulse was steady now, almost calm. "So is being erased politely." He studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head once, a soldier's acknowledgement, not a guardian's permission. "Then we prepare," he said. Nancy picked up the faded ribbon and held it out. He didn't take it. "It is yours," he said. "Not tonight." She folded it back into the leather case and closed the lid. "Tonight it is evidence that I was not imagined." Outside, rain began again against the library windows, soft and relentless. Inside, by lamp and ledgers, and an old blue ribbon that had survived 11 years, Nancy Muller stopped enduring and began to plan where to strike. Rain ticked harder against the panes as Brindle appeared in the library doorway with a salver and a face carved into professional calm. "A rider from Southampton, Your Grace, returned at speed." Alistair took the folded note, broke the seal, read, and passed it to Nancy without a word. "No such attorney as Peter Glave is enrolled in Southampton," it said. "Not in any adjacent district. Notary mark, counterfeit. Parish clerk recalls inquiry by lady's maid matching Bexley livery 3 weeks prior regarding birth registers for Muller family." 3 weeks, Nancy said, "before I ever left her house." "She was preparing this before the fall in the drive," Alistair answered. As if summoned by that recognition, Brindle set 2 more items on the table. 1 envelope with Lady Harrow's crest, 1 with the seal of Cresswell and Pike, solicitors to half the county. Alistair opened the first. Lady Harrow regretted to inform his Grace that circulating letters concerning Miss Muller had rendered her presence socially and morally contentious, and that any continued public endorsement of such a person might distress Lady Eleanor's future prospects. The second was colder. Cresswell and Pike gave notice that, on instruction from Lady Bexley, they had applied to Chancery to freeze any residual Muller Trust assets pending legitimacy review. They also advised that Miss Muller had no legal standing to challenge management decisions in the late Mr. Muller's estate until lineage is settled. Nancy set the page down very carefully. If she freezes the trust, she controls the funds during inquiry. Yes, and inquiries can last years. Yes. Long enough to make me costly, inconvenient, unmarriageable, and eventually compliant. Alistair's gaze did not leave her face. That is the design. Lady Bexley's move was elegant in its viciousness. No shouting, no melodrama, no public slap. Ink and seals routed through men who preferred paper to people. If the petition held, Nancy would not only lose money, she would lose legal leverage, the right to speak as claimant rather than supplicant. Sir Piers would offer marriage again as benevolence. Society would call it restoration. Brindle cleared his throat. There is one further matter, Your Grace. Mr. Holt from the London Banking Registry called personally. He was uneasy. Uneasy how? He reports Lady Bexley's man requested certified abstracts of the Muller ledgers this afternoon, specifically disbursement years 17 through 21. Nancy's head snapped up. Those are the siphoned years. Which means, Alistair said, already moving to the desk, she knows exactly what records could condemn her. He wrote 3 notes in quick, hard strokes, one to his solicitor, one to the county registrar, one to Captain Fane, an old intelligence man now in private employ. Brindle took them and vanished. Nancy, Alistair said, the name roughened by urgency, where are your father's originals now? In the old office at Bexley, false-backed drawer in the west desk. Could anyone else know? She never saw me use it, but Lady Bexley notices absences the way bankers notice sums. Then we retrieve them tonight. She nodded once. I'm coming. He didn't argue this time. They left within the hour in a closed carriage with Brindle and 2 mounted men behind. London thinned to turnpike darkness and wet hedgerows. Nancy counted milestones by habit, pulse beating with each mile as if distance itself might erase what waited. Near dawn they reached the Hampshire house. No lamps burned in front rooms, but light leaked beneath the old office door at the west end. Nancy felt her stomach drop. Brindle forced the outer lock. They entered to the smell of wet ashes. Her father's desk stood open, drawers pulled, papers heaped and rifled across the rug. In the grate, charred curls of ledger paper still glowed at their edges. Nancy crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to her knees, and yanked at the false back with trembling fingers. Empty. Not one book, not one loose folio. Nothing but a smear of soot where bindings had rested for years. She sat back on her heels, unable for a moment to draw breath. Behind her, a slow clap sounded from the doorway. Lady Bexley stood there in travelling velvet, veil pinned neatly despite the hour, a liveried man with a dispatch case half a pace behind her. At Lady Bexley's shoulder stood Mr. Kent, a local magistrate Nancy recognised from harvest dinners. "My poor child," Lady Bexley said softly, "breaking into your family home before dawn, in front of witnesses. How desperate!" "This was my father's office," Nancy said, rising, "and is now legally mine." Lady Bexley extended a paper toward Mr. Kent. "As you see, sir, she has entered without permission and interfered with private account materials already under legal review." Mr. Kent shifted, uncomfortable but cautious. "Miss Muller, perhaps if you step away from the desk—" Alistair moved between Nancy and them, voice glacial. "This house is under dispute. Your presence here at this hour, Lady Bexley, suggests foreknowledge rather than concern." She smiled at him. "Your Grace mistakes maternal vigilance for conspiracy. I was informed by staff that Miss Muller intended theatrics." Lady Bexley glanced toward the grate, where scorched fragments collapsed inward, and gave a small, regretful sigh. "What a pity! Evidence is so delicate when handled in panic." Nancy stared at the grate. One corner of a page had survived enough to show her father's hand. Neat columns, the tail of a 7, burned through the middle. "You burned them," she said. Lady Bexley's brows rose in delicate surprise. "Accusation is dangerous when one is already under legal cloud. Mr. Kent cleared his throat again. "I strongly advise all parties to submit claims through counsel." "Of course," Lady Bexley said, all compliance. "And because I am nothing if not merciful, I shall refrain from pressing charges for trespass, provided Miss Muller returns quietly to my protection, until the legitimacy petition is settled." Nancy laughed then, once, a sound with no mirth in it at all. "Protection!" Alistair's hand came lightly to her elbow, steadying, without restraining. "We are leaving," he said. As they turned, Lady Bexley called after them, voice sweet as rot. "Oh, and your Grace, do check your own clerks. Reliability among hired men is such a gamble." In the carriage back, Nancy sat rigid, soot on her gloves, the scent of burned paper still lodged in her throat. Alistair said nothing until they had crossed into Surrey. Then, "I'm sorry." She did not look at him. "For what? Believing we were only hours behind instead of days? For not moving sooner? For underestimating her appetite?" Nancy pressed her soot-marked thumb into her palm until pain steadied her. "Without those ledgers I have memory and indignation. She has stamps and witnesses, and Sir Piers will press his claim from behind her papers, as he always has. We still have banking traces, transfer patterns. Patterns are suspicion, originals are proof." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. By the time they reached Norcroft House, another blow waited. Brindle met them in the hall, pale beneath composure. "Your Grace, Mr. Holt from the registry has resigned and left London overnight. No forwarding address." Nancy closed her eyes. Of course, the clerk who could authenticate the disbursement chain was gone, bought, frightened, or both. The room seemed to tilt as if the carriage had never stopped moving. Lady Eleanor came down the stairs in her wrapper, took one look at Nancy's face and said nothing at all, only wrapped both hands around Nancy's ash-streaked ones and held on while the house breathed around them. That afternoon, Nancy shut herself in her room and did not come down for tea, nor for dinner, nor when Lady Eleanor knocked gently at midnight. For the first time since she had left Bexley, she allowed herself to think the most dangerous thought, that Lady Bexley might win, not by force, but by paperwork and patience, that truth without documents was merely a story told by an inconvenient woman. Alistair did not sleep. Near 2 a.m, he sat alone in his study. Fire burned low, the blue ribbon case open beside a stack of unanswered correspondence. Rain had stopped. The silence after it seemed louder than weather. He had spent half his life mastering control, because control kept men from seeing where to wound him. In Parliament, in committees, in county disputes, composure was currency. Tonight it felt like cowardice dressed as discipline. He had brought Nancy into his house on a promise of protection and watched her lose the very evidence that could free her. Worse, Lady Bexley had not merely struck Nancy. She had struck through him, proving she could move faster than a duke if the battleground was reputation and domestic law. He picked up the old blue ribbon. Careful as one handles something breakable, not because it is fragile, but because it has survived too much already. At 17 he had kept it for reasons he never named aloud. At 31 he could name them all and trusted none of them. Gratitude, obsession, memory, guilt. She had been the first person in years to touch him without calculation. No title in her eyes, no flattery, no fear, only irritation that he bled on her flour sacks. He had built a private mythology around that night because mythology was easier than intimacy. Real women had choices, anger, ambition, and no obligation to fulfill a boy's rescued fantasy. Now she was real and furious and cornered, and he wanted, God help him, to gather every legal weapon he possessed and end this by brute force. Marry her at once by special license. Place her beyond challenge under his name, dare anyone to object. He could do it. He had done harsher things for causes he believed less in, and it would be another form of purchase. The door opened without knock. Eleanor stepped in barefoot, hair braided over one shoulder, holding 2 cups of tea, as if she were still 12 and sneaking into the schoolroom after nightmares. "You pace when you cannot fix things," she said, setting 1 cup down. "Tonight you sit, worse sign." He almost told her to go back to bed. Instead, he said, "I failed her." Eleanor leaned against the desk. "You failed to predict a viper's exact strike. That is not the same." "I should have removed her from Bexley entirely months ago when the first rumours began." "She was not yours to remove," Eleanor said sharply. "Don't rewrite this into a story where only your action matters." He flinched because the rebuke was deserved. After a moment she added softer, "Are you afraid for her or afraid of yourself?" He gave a humourless smile. "Both." Eleanor waited. Alistair stared into the tea he had not touched. "Father used law to silence Mother. Perfectly legal settlements, perfectly legal humiliations, every cruelty receipted. I swore I would never make a woman dependent on my protection and call it devotion. And now the fastest way to shield Nancy would be to do exactly that." His voice thinned. "Offer marriage as a barricade before she has one in her own name." Eleanor's eyes shone suddenly, fierce and wet at once. "Then do not offer barricades, offer alliance. She is not asking to be hidden, Alistair. She is asking to be believed." He looked at his sister, the child he had half raised after their mother died, the one person before Nancy who spoke to him as if rank were merely an administrative inconvenience, and felt something in his chest loosen by a fraction. "She may lose," he said. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Then she loses standing upright, not carried." When she left, he remained where he was, ribbon in hand, while first light diluted the dark at the windows. By morning the crisis had teeth. At 11, a county officer arrived with 2 men and a sealed writ alleging that Miss Nancy Muller had unlawfully removed and altered financial instruments belonging to Lady Bexley and was required to present herself for examination within 24 hours. Failure would permit arrest. Brindle received them in the front hall with impeccable civility and delayed acceptance until Alistair came down. Alistair read the writ once, then again. "This is signed by Magistrate Kent." "Yes, Your Grace," the officer said, sweating slightly. "Routine matter. If the lady attends, likely nothing further." "Routine," Alistair repeated, voice like winter. After the men left, Nancy stood in the hall holding the copy. She had gone pale, but her hands were steady now. "If I go," she said, "I walk into her narrative, unstable, thieving, in need of supervision." "If you don't," Alistair said, "she has grounds to drag you publicly from this house." Lady Eleanor came in from the breakfast room, clutching a fresh card so hard the edge bent. "There's more." It was Lady Bexley's masquerade invitation, delivered to Norcroft that morning with vulgar punctuality. On the reverse, in Lady Bexley's neat script, "Delighted you can attend tonight." Magistrates Kent, Raleigh and Finch confirmed. Sir Piers eager to conclude family arrangements before tomorrow's hearing. Do come masked. Truth is so much easier in costume. Nancy read it and smiled. A small, dangerous smile Alistair had never seen before. "She means to stage my surrender," Nancy said. "Announce contracts in front of the men who will hear the writ." "Then we do not attend," he said immediately. She looked at him. "If we do not attend, she controls the room, the witnesses, and the story. By dawn, I am a fugitive who refused examination." He hated that she was right. Brindle entered again, this time with Captain Fane, rain spattered and grim. Fane set a wrapped parcel on the table and nodded to Nancy. "Intercepted from a dismissed Bexley footman trying to sell waste paper in 7 Dials," he said. "Didn't know what he had. Thought it was kindling." Brindle unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay 3 half-burned ledger sections, edges blackened, centres intact enough to show columns in Johann Müller's hand, dates, disbursements, and in one surviving margin, a notation in red, transferred at LB instruction, not in trust terms. Nancy's breath caught. "Not complete," Fane warned, "and chain of custody will be contested." "But real," she said. "Real enough to start a fire in a crowded room," Alistair murmured. The clock on the mantel struck noon. 8 hours to the masquerade. 24 to the writ deadline. A house full of enemies waiting in silk and masks. 3 magistrates who might yet listen, or might decide before she spoke. Nancy touched the charred edge of her father's page, then lifted her chin. "Have my black gown pressed," she said to Brindle. "No jewels." She looked to Alistair, and this time there was no distance at all in her voice, only decision. "Tonight," she said, "we stop her where she built the lie." Outside, another carriage rolled up the Norcroft Drive. Through the glass panels of the door they could already see a Bexley livery crest on the messenger's coat. The messenger was shown into the morning room with rain on his shoulders and Bexley colours on his sleeve. He bowed, presented a narrow lacquered box and said, "From Lady Bexley to Miss Muller's own hand." Nancy broke the wax. Inside lay a silver half-mask, black gloves, and a folded card in Lady Bexley's precise script. "Wear these. We must look united before county eyes. Sign the enclosed acknowledgement before midnight and all unpleasant legal motions may be softened." Beneath it, a single-page declaration waited, already witnessed by 2 names Nancy did not recognise. It stated that Miss Nancy Müller accepted Lady Bexley's guardianship, pending clarification of birth and capacity, and consented to family marriage arrangements. Nancy read it once, then handed it to Alistair. "A collar," he said. "Silk-lined," she answered. She tore the declaration in half, then in quarters, and set the pieces back in the box. "Return this to the messenger." Brindle took it, expression unreadable and eyes bright with something close to approval. By 10 that night the Bexley ballroom blazed with candlelight and deceit. Masks glittered above powdered faces. Musicians soared through a gavotte while servants moved with trays of champagne and sweetmeats. Gold gauze draped the gallery. Mirrors doubled everything. Diamonds, laughter, malice. Nancy entered on Alistair's arm in plain black silk. No jewels, hair simply dressed. Her mask was matte, unadorned. Lady Eleanor walked just behind, silver-masked and fierce as a drawn blade. Whispers rippled at once. "There she is! Norcroft brought her openly." "After the writ?" Lady Bexley descended from the far end of the room in peacock blue satin, emerald ring flashing at her hand. She wore no mask at all. "My dear child," she called, voice carrying sweetly above the violins, "how relieved I am you came. Your obstinacy has worried us all." Nancy inclined her head. "Concern is kind." Sir Piers appeared at Lady Bexley's shoulder, masked in gilt, his smile visible even through lace cutwork. "Miss Müller, shall we conclude tonight like civilised people?" Lady Bexley clapped once for attention. The music faltered, then ceased. "Friends," she said, drawing the room into her palm. Before dancing resumes, A small family matter. In these unsettled days, rumour harms innocent women. To protect my late husband's daughter and secure her future, I have accepted Sir Piers Allerton's honourable offer. Contracts are drafted. Understanding is complete. A murmur of approval rolled outward. Magistrates Kent, Rowley and Finch stood near the card-room doors, watchful, already half committed by public framing. Lady Bexley turned, palm extended to Nancy like a stage cue. "Come, child, let us end this nonsense." Nancy didn't move. Then she stepped forward, alone, into the cleared space between chandeliers and watching faces, and removed both gloves. "Before any contract is celebrated," she said, voice calm and carrying, "I ask leave to read from my father's accounts." Lady Bexley laughed softly. "No, this is neither the hour nor the place for feminine dramatics." Nancy held up the first charred ledger section. Blackened edges caught candlelight like burnt lace. "This page survived your great." The laughter died. Sir Piers barked, "Absurd! Forgery!" "Is it?" Nancy turned toward the magistrates. "Mr. Kent, you signed today's writ alleging I altered instruments. Please look at line 17. My father's hand witnessed disbursement to Bexley Trust and margin notation in red, his private ink, imported from Mainz, known to his clerk and factor, both. Transferred at L.B. instruction, not in trust terms." Kent frowned and stepped closer, despite himself. Rowley leaned in beside him. Nancy produced a second page, then a third. "Incomplete, yes, so I did what numbers allow when paper burns. I reconstructed the missing years from registry abstracts, rent rolls, and interest accrual lodged publicly at London Banking Registry." She looked directly at Lady Bexley. "You siphoned from tenant-daughter education funds, from widow annuities, and from my majority trust. You split transfers into amounts below review thresholds and rotated them through Sir Piers's lending house to hide origin." A sharp intake moved through the crowd. Lady Bexley's smile sharpened. "Astonishing performance. A governess turns auditor and expects gentlemen to abandon law for our arithmetic tricks." Nancy lifted another sheet, this one clean, newly copied in her own hand. "No trick. Pattern. If £1,200 leaves Trust A in March and appears as private bond purchase in April, then returns as debt secured against me in June, the money has not vanished. It has changed mask." She let the word hang. Sir Piers stepped forward, flushed. "You insolent little—" "Your Grace, control your dependent." Alistair did not move. "She requires no control." Lady Bexley pivoted instantly. "Then perhaps she requires correction of character." Her voice rang brighter, crueler. "Since she prefers public scenes, yes, I sought to settle her quickly. A girl who throws herself into a duke's arms in the rain leaves guardians little choice. Compromise must be managed." The room leaned towards scandal. Hungry, Nancy met Lady Bexley's gaze and answered clearly, "A woman sold by her family is not ruined, my lady. Only your accounts are." Silence fell so hard even the candles seemed to steady. Lady Bexley struck back at once. "Magistrates, I submit letters from Southampton proving illegitimacy and debt. She has no claim to Müller funds, no standing to accuse." Nancy nodded. "Produce them." Lady Bexley's man opened the dispatch case, handed over folded documents. Kent scanned, then hesitated. Before he could speak, Nancy said, "The notary does not exist. We sent inquiry and received sworn response yesterday. The parish clerk remembers your maid requesting birth records 3 weeks ago. And your seal wax on those letters contains crushed malachite, your preferred colourant. Ordinary legal wax does not." Rowley looked up sharply. "You tested wax?" "I read what men presume I cannot." Lady Bexley's composure thinned for the first time. "Circumstantial noise." None of this rebuts my guardianship or her instability. Sir Piers seized the opening and flourished a document. Here, her marriage consent, signed. Nancy took one look and laughed once, cold. That is not my signature. I cross my N in correspondence always. This hand does not. Also, under my father's trust clause, no marriage contract binds without my spoken assent before 2 independent witnesses after age 21. Ask your own solicitors. They wrote the clause. A stir at the back. Cresswell himself pale beneath his domino mask. Lady Bexley wheeled on him. Well, Cresswell swallowed. The clause exists. Everything shifted. Alistair stepped forward then, voice cutting clean through the room. I submit authenticated copies from Norcroft records and sworn statements from registry staff. He signalled Brindle, who brought a sealed packet and placed it in Magistrate Finch's hands. Finch broke the seal, read rapidly, and passed pages to the others. Faces changed, scepticism to discomfort to something harder. Lady Bexley understood the turn and made one last play. She lifted her chin and said loudly, Even if sums were mismanaged, this girl's reputation is ash. No honourable house will take her now. Alistair turned to Nancy before all of them. Then let mine, he said, voice suddenly unsteady. Miss Muller, Nancy, marry me. Gasps broke like glass. Nancy looked at him a long moment, then shook her head once. No. The room recoiled. Lady Bexley exhaled in visible triumph. Nancy kept her eyes on Alistair. Not as shelter, not as payment, not because I bled on your hand and society sharpened knives. Ask me as if my mind matters after tonight. He went still. Then he stepped closer, discarded every formal distance he had ever used with her, and said low but clear enough for the room, I love you. I have for longer than I understood. I do not want a wife I can protect and display. I want you beside me where decisions are made, arguing when I am wrong, building what I would never imagine alone. Will you choose that with me? Nancy's breath caught. She saw no rescue in his face, only risk and truth. Yes, she said. Lady Bexley did not collapse. She attacked. This is coercion, she snapped. A theatrical entrapment by a duke infatuated with a schemer. I demand immediate removal of Miss Muller under existing writ. Magistrate Kent, sweating, lifted the writ. The order stands until challenged by fraud evidence presented in your presence, Finch cut in, sharper now, and we have just seen substantial irregularity. Sir Piers slammed his cane against the floor. Irregularity! I am owed £30,000 on valid notes. Norcroft may buy paper, but not erase debt. Alistair's gaze flicked to him. Your notes were sold to me. You are owed nothing by Miss Muller. Sir Piers bared his teeth. Then I accuse her of theft of confidential instruments, and you of conspiracy. Nancy stepped in before Alistair could answer. You accuse because delay is profit. Every month this drags. You collect fees against estates you hollowed. She turned to the magistrates. Ask Sir Piers where the Education Trust disbursement of May 1816 was routed before reappearing as my alleged personal debt in August. He cannot answer without naming Lady Bexley's private account. Sir Piers blustered. I don't carry petty figures in my head. I do, Nancy said, because they were my father's. Kent tried to recover authority. Enough! This requires formal hearing, not ballroom argument. Agreed, Finch said. Now, library. Within minutes, half the glittering company crowded the gallery while principals were ushered into Lady Bexley's library. Kent, Rowley, Finch, Cresswell and Pike, Alistair, Nancy, Lady Bexley, Sir Piers. Brindle stood discreetly at the door, like a stone with opinions. Lady Bexley opened with poise regained. Gentlemen, my late husband entrusted me with chaotic books and an ungoverned stepdaughter. I made practical transfers to preserve solvency. If lines blurred, it was necessity, Nancy asked. Necessity to purchase emeralds and a Paris carriage? Colour rose in Lady Bexley's cheeks. How dare you inventory my private expenses? They were paid from trust accounts restricted by deed. Cresswell shifted. Lady Bexley, did you authorise withdrawals against the Miller girls' scholarship allotment? Temporary reallocations. Without court leave? No answer. Sir Piers cut in. This is witch hunting by column and ink blot. Where are originals? Nancy placed the charred sections on the table. Burned in my father's grate this morning. Lady Bexley gave a small shrug. Tragic accident. Brindle spoke for the first time. With respect, my lady, your housekeeper signed statement that fires in that room were forbidden pending legal review, yet coals were active at dawn. Kent snapped. You are a servant, sir. Brindle inclined his head. I'm also a witness. Fane was admitted then, muddy boots and all, bearing sworn deposition from the Seven Dials bookseller and the dismissed footman who sold the salvage. The footman's statement named Lady Bexley's maid as the one who ordered all old Müller ledgers to kitchen grate before first light. Lady Bexley's control finally cracked. Lies from drunkards and thieves! Nancy leaned forward, voice low and exact. Then let us test mathematics, which does not drink. Here, she spread her reconstruction sheets. Missing months can be back-calculated from interest entries lodged publicly by your own banker. You took principal from Trust C, booked it as repair reserve, then lent same sum through Allerton House at 9% to cover Bexley hunting debts. These signatures, she tapped 2 lines, are by different clerks. Same day, identical ink dilution. Prepared together. Pike, older and less timid than Cresswell, adjusted spectacles and studied. Good God! Sir Piers lunged for the pages. Alistair caught his wrist mid-air and held it until Sir Piers winced. Touch her evidence again, Alistair said softly. And I forget civility. Finch rose. That is enough. I am ordering immediate sequestration of Lady Bexley's movable assets, pending full accounting. Sir Piers Allerton's related claims are suspended, Sir Piers sputtered. You cannot. I can, Finch said. And will. Kent looked ill. Rowley avoided Nancy's eyes. Lady Bexley stood very straight, hands shaking only at the fingertips. You all mistake temporary impropriety for crime, Nancy answered. No, my lady, I mistake nothing any more. When officers arrived to inventory plate, jewels and carriage papers, Lady Bexley did not plead. She turned to Nancy once in the doorway and hissed, too low for others. You think this makes you equal to them? Nancy met her without flinching. No, I know it makes me free of you. Lady Bexley's mouth twisted. Rage, disbelief, perhaps the first trace of fear. Then she swept out under guard, silk whispering like a retreating storm. Sir Piers tried for bravado as he was escorted after her. This is not finished, Finch said dryly. For you, sir, it may be continental. It was near dawn when they left Bexley House. The ballroom candles had burned low. Wax and wilted flowers scented the air. Outside, frost silvered the gravel where Nancy had once knelt in rain. She paused at the top step, suddenly light-headed, as if the body that had carried her through battle had discovered it could tremble now. Lady Eleanor wrapped a cloak around her shoulders from behind. If you faint, I shall be furious, she whispered. I'm considering it purely for drama. Denied. Alistair stood a pace away, giving her space and watching as though she might vanish if he blinked. In the carriage, no one spoke for the first mile. Then Brindle, from the forward seat, said quietly, Miss Mueller, the officers accepted Captain Fane's chain of custody statements. Your writ is stayed pending review. You are not required to present tomorrow. Nancy shut her eyes. The relief was so sharp it hurt. Thank you, she said. At Norcroft House, servants who had stayed up all night pretended not to be waiting in the hall, then failed magnificently. A footman smiled, the kitchen maid curtsied with tears in her lashes. Brindle coughed into his hand and declared breakfast would be served whenever our people wished. Our people. Nancy went upstairs, stood in her room with its neat bed and folded gowns, and looked at her hands. Ink smudges, burn marks on one cuff. No gloves now, no mask. A knock sounded. Alistair's voice, low through the door. May I come in? She opened it. For a moment they simply stood there in the pale edge of morning, both exhausted beyond elegance. You were magnificent, he said. I was terrified. So was I. She gave a tired half laugh. Good. I dislike being the only coward in a room. His expression softened, then sobered. You are many things, Nancy. Coward is not one. She nodded, unable suddenly to find words that weren't too small or too dangerous. Sleep, he said at last. We speak when you wake. When the door closed, she sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time in years, let herself cry, quietly, briefly, from release rather than defeat. She found him that evening in the West Library. No fire this time, only lamplight and winter dusk at the windows. The leather case lay on the table between stacks of legal memoranda. He rose when she entered, as if uncertain whether to approach. I hoped you'd come, he said. Nancy crossed the room and set a folded paper down. Finch's provisional order, trust review in 10 days. Temporary control removed from Lady Bexley. He let out a breath. Good. Silence gathered, not awkward, charged. At last Nancy said, About last night. Yes. You asked in front of half the county. I did. I said no. You did. She met his eyes. Then I said yes. A faint, almost disbelieving smile touched his mouth. You did. She moved to the window, fingers resting on cold glass. I need you to hear the part I could not say in that room. I cannot enter another cage, no matter how gilded. I won't be managed kindly. I won't be erased politely. If we marry, I keep work that is mine. I keep my name in legal papers, at least where possible. I do not surrender judgment. Behind her, his answer came without pause. Agreed. She turned. You didn't even pretend to negotiate. I have spent months discovering that your judgment is usually better than mine when people are involved. Why would I negotiate against my own interest? Despite everything, she laughed. Then his face changed. Guard dropping by, deliberate choice. I need you to hear mine, he said. I am not easy. I control rooms when I'm afraid. I go cold when I care too much because cold has kept me functional. I watched my father use provision and protection as instruments of possession, and I swore never to become him. Last night, when I asked you to marry me, I nearly repeated his shape out of panic. You corrected, she said, because you made me. He stepped closer, voice roughening. Nancy, I did not keep that blue ribbon because of a childish fantasy alone. I kept it because in one brutal night, an 11-year-old girl treated me as human before title. Every year since, I measured people against that honesty and found most wanting, including myself. His hand opened over the table. In his palm lay the faded blue ribbon, carefully smoothed. I have loved you in absence, he said. I would rather learn to love you in truth, where you can contradict me. Her throat tightened painfully. I can do that very well. I know. She reached out, touched the ribbon, then his hand beneath it. I do not love you because you can save me. I love you because you see me, even when I am inconvenient. Especially then, he said. She looked down at their hands. There is one condition more. Name it. On the Norcroft estate, we open a schoolroom for tenants' daughters. Reading, accounts, correspondence, land arithmetic, not charity embroidery. Competence. His smile this time was real and unguarded. Done. Endowment from my private income. Curriculum at your command. Joint command, she corrected. Joint, he agreed. He hesitated, then lifted his uninjured hand toward her face, in silent question. She nodded. His fingertips brushed her cheek. Gentle, astonished, as if touch were a language he had spoken poorly for years and was relearning with care. May I kiss you? He asked. Yes. The kiss was not dramatic. It was deliberate, warm, and profoundly steadying. Promise more than possession. When they parted, he rested his forehead briefly against hers and said, almost in wonder, You stayed. You asked rightly, she answered. 2 weeks later, the county auctioneer stood in Lady Bexley's forecourt, shouting numbers over a crowd that had come pretending moral concern and stayed for bargains. Nancy watched from a plain carriage beside Lady Eleanor as a pair of emerald earrings, once brandished like weapons, went under the hammer to a brewer's wife for less than half their vanity value. Poetic, Eleanor murmured. In the next lot, Lady Bexley's Paris carriage sold to a wool factor from Portsmouth. Wheels creaked as it was led away. No one applauded. At the magistrate's bench that afternoon, Finch confirmed formal charges of fraud, document forgery, and trust misappropriation. Lady Bexley, pale and rigid, signed restricted settlement papers rather than face criminal trial that would expose every correspondence she had leveraged. She retained a small dower house and little else. When she passed Nancy in the corridor, she stopped. You should thank me, Lady Bexley said quietly. Hardship made you interesting. Nancy regarded her, feeling no triumph now, only distance. Cruelty made me prepared, not beholden. Lady Bexley's laugh was brittle glass. Enjoy your duke. I intend to enjoy my life, Nancy said, and walked on. Sir Piers did not stay to hear final orders. 3 days later, at Southampton docks, he boarded a packet for Calais under a cloud of muttered jokes he could neither challenge nor silence. Captain Fane sent brief confirmation. Allerton departed. Credit thin, temper worse. At Norcroft, spring began in mud and pale sunlight. In a former estate storeroom, Nancy stood with sleeves rolled, while carpenters set benches and a slate board. Girls peered through the doorway, tenant daughters in patched shawls, eyes wary and bright. Come in, Nancy called. No one is too dirty for arithmetic. A small red-haired girl stepped first. Will there be sums every day, my lady? Every day, Nancy said gravely, and letters. And how not to be cheated by men with elegant handwriting. Behind her, Alistair leaned in the doorway, coat off, carrying a crate of primers like any clerk. Where do you want these? By the window, she said, and you're late. I married badly, he told the room. She runs a strict establishment. The girls giggled. Nancy did not hide her smile. On their wedding morning, chapel bells rang across the Norcroft lawns, clear, unhurried, nothing like the dinner bell that had once summoned her to blows. In her dressing room, Lady Eleanor fastened the last pearl pin and stepped back with wet eyes she pretended were not wet. You look terrifyingly happy, Eleanor accused. I am practising. Downstairs in the small family chapel, Alistair waited in dark coat and restrained nerves, speaking too politely to the vicar and to no one else. When Nancy reached him at the vestry door, he turned, and for a second looked exactly as he had in rain 11 years and 11 weeks apart, struck, disarmed, entirely present. He held out a small leather case. "For you," he said. Inside lay the old blue ribbon, faded and tender with time. Nancy touched it, then closed the case and placed it in her bouquet. From her wrist she untied a fresh ribbon, deep blue, and took his injured hand, the one she had bound in gravel and blood. "Permit me, Your Grace," she said. His mouth curved. "Always." She wrapped the ribbon around his wrist and tied a sailor's hitch, firm and quick. He looked down at the knot, then back at her. "How long may I keep this one?" Nancy smiled, sunlight and steel together. "As long as you like." Then she took his arm, and together they stepped into the chapel light.